Alicia Carter stands by her car, exhaustion pressing down on her like a weight she cannot shake. The night is quiet, the gas station nearly empty, a place that should feel safe, but never truly does. The dim glow of the overhead lights flickers, casting long shadows on the pavement. She grips her phone tightly, listening to her son's voice on the other end. His small, tired voice reminds her that home is just a short drive away. She takes a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of relief. Unaware that safety is an illusion she cannot afford, the roar of approaching engines shatters the stillness. The sudden flash of red and blue lights reflects off the glass windows, distorting her reflection. Tires screech against the pavement as multiple police cruisers come to a stop. The moment stretches, elongated by the weight of what is about to unfold. Doors slam open, the sound sharp and final. Alicia turns slowly, her breath catching in her throat as two officers step forward. Their hands hover near their weapons, their eyes cold and assessing. The air changes, thick with something, unspoken yet unmistakable. Every instinct tells her to remain still, to move cautiously, to speak carefully. Fear coils in her stomach, but she forces herself to stay calm. She tries to explain, to make them see her as a person, not a threat. Her words come out measured, steady despite the tremor she feels inside. The officers don't seem to hear her. Their stances remain rigid, their gazes unwavering. The tension crackles in the air, a silent battle where the outcome feels predetermined. The weight of every news story she has ever seen, every warning she has ever heard, settles over her like a suffocating blanket. She raises her hands slowly, palms open, a universal gesture of surrender. The officers bark orders, voices overlapping, conflicting. Confusion surges through her as she tries to comply, tries to navigate the impossible tightrope of survival. Her phone slips from her fingers, falling to the pavement with a dull thud. The sound echoes louder than it should, or maybe it's the way her son's voice still crackles through the speaker. His fear is tangible, pressing against her chest like a physical force. She wants to reach for the phone, to reassure him, but she doesn't dare move. One wrong gesture, one misstep, and this moment could become something far worse. Her pulse pounds in her ears, her breath shallow and uneven. The world has narrowed to this moment, to the space between her and the men who refuse to see her humanity. She knows what they see instead, and she knows that may be all that matters. Alicia's breath is uneven, her pulse hammering as the weight of the moment settles around her. The phone lies face down on the pavement, her son's voice barely audible. Through the speaker, his cries slice through the night, desperate, terrified, but no one moves to pick it up. The officers don't care, they don't hear him. Or worse, they hear him and choose to ignore it. Daniel's grip on his gun tightens, his eyes sharp and unreadable. He isn't listening. He isn't trying to understand. Alicia knows better than to beg, but what else is left? Her hands tremble. In the air, the universal sign of surrender. Yet to them, it is never enough. The bystanders remain frozen, some clutching their phones but none daring to intervene. They exchange uneasy glances, their faces tight with fear. They've seen stories like this before. They know how they end. Alicia swallows hard, trying to steady herself. Her voice is thin but firm. She tells them she's a nurse, that she just finished a shift, that she only stopped for gas. Daniels doesn't flinch. His jaw clenches as if every word she speaks is an insult. Miller shifts beside him, the younger officer glancing at Alicia's scrubs, at her hands, at her eyes. He hesitates, just for a moment, but Daniels doesn't. "You fit the description," Daniels snaps, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Alicia's stomach twists. The description of what? She already knows the answer. A black woman. That's all it ever takes. Her mind spins back to the warnings from her mother, the hushed conversations about staying small, about being polite, about making sure to survive. She remembers being 16, being followed around a store. 21, pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. 32, standing here now, knowing that none of it mattered. At home, her son grips his phone with both hands, his small fingers white from the pressure. His breath hitches as he listens to the voices, to the sharp commands, to his mother's voice growing more unsteady. He doesn't know what to do. His hands shake as he dials the number of a neighbor, his voice breaking as he begs for help. A new set of headlights cuts through the dark, tires rolling to a stop just beyond the scene. Officer Jonathan Reed steps out of his cruiser, eyes narrowing as he takes in the situation. The way Alicia stands frozen. The way Daniels has his weapon drawn. The way Miller looks uneasy but refuses to move. It takes him less than a second to understand what's happening. He steps forward, his voice even. He tells them to lower their weapons, that she is not a threat. Daniels barely glances at him. Standard procedure. Daniels mutters, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. Reed's jaw tightens. He's heard those words before, used as a shield, as an excuse. He looks at Alicia, the way her chest rises and falls too quickly, the way her hands remain in the air as though gravity itself has given up on them. Miller's hesitation grows. He clears his throat, shifts his weight, looks at Reed like he's waiting for permission to step back. But Daniels is unwavering, his pride too thick, too stubborn. Reed speaks again, firmer this time. He tells them this isn't right, that they have no reason to escalate. Daniels scoffs. You gonna start defending suspects now? Alicia exhales shakily. Suspect. She's done nothing, said nothing, but in his eyes, she is already guilty. Reed doesn't flinch. He meets Daniels's gaze without fear. You pull that trigger, the whole world is going to see what you've done. Silence stretches between them, thick and suffocating. Alicia sways slightly, exhaustion and adrenaline warring within her. Then she speaks, her voice raw, barely more than a whisper. Is my life worth less than your pride? The words hang in the air, heavy, undeniable. Reed steps between them, his body blocking the gun's path. Slowly, deliberately, he reaches for his own weapon and holsters it. His hands are open, empty, showing Daniels and Miller what restraint looks like. The tension in the air is thick, crackling like electricity. Daniels stands rigid, his hand hovering near his gun, eyes fixed on Alicia. The weight of his gaze is like a sentence, one she hasn't earned, but is trapped under. Reed stands a few paces away, his hands trembling ever so slightly, the inner conflict evident in his stance. He knows what he has to do, but the weight of the system, the expectation, the fear of backlash, it all presses against him. Alicia stands still, her hands raised slightly, her whole body trembling. The sweat on her skin is cold. Her heart pounds. She's been here before, in places like this, under eyes like theirs, but never this close to the edge. The crowd is silent, watching, waiting. A few murmurs here and there, but no one moves. No one intervenes. Then the phone hits the ground with a soft thud. The sound of her son's voice, just barely audible through the broken speaker, echoes in her mind, a ghost of panic. His words freeze her blood. The police officers tighten their grips on their weapons, but something shifts in the air. A hesitation, a flicker of doubt in Daniel's eyes. Too quick for anyone to catch, except Reed. He sees it. He knows it's there. His voice is calm, almost too calm, as he steps forward. Back down, Reed warns, his eyes meeting Daniel's. His hands are visibly shaking, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Or I report you. Daniels shifts slightly, a low growl escaping from his throat. His hand twitches near the trigger, but he doesn't pull it. Not yet. In the distance, a phone screen lights up. It's a bystander, the camera pointing straight at them. Reed notices it immediately. His voice gains strength. They're recording. The whole world is watching. A flicker of panic in Daniel's eyes, barely perceptible, but it's there. He glances at the crowd, the camera, then back at Reed. The murmurs in the crowd start to swell, growing louder, fear turning into anger. Alicia's son bursts through the crowd, his tiny legs carrying him toward her, eyes wide with terror. His hands reach for her, his breath sharp and frantic. Reed's voice is steady, authoritative. He speaks not as an officer but as a human. She's not a threat. She's a mother. Look at her. For a moment, time seems to slow. Daniels looks at Alicia, then at her son, and for the briefest second, his grip on his weapon falters. The mask of authority cracks, and in its place is a brief, fleeting moment of recognition. But just as quickly as it appeared, the moment is gone. Daniels lowers his gun, but the anger still simmers beneath his expression. His jaw clenches, and without a word, he turns his back on Reed, his footsteps echoing in the tension-laden silence. Reed steps forward, his voice firm. "You know what you did. You know what this is." Daniels doesn't respond, his eyes hardening as he walks away. Alicia collapses to the ground, her legs no longer able to hold her. Her body trembles uncontrollably, and her son clings to her, his tears soaking into her scrubs. The air is thick, the crowd slowly dispersing, but the weight of what just happened lingers. Reed watches them, his face unreadable. He knows what he has to do. "I'm filing a report," he mutters under his breath. He doesn't care what it costs him. Alicia's son looks up at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with silent fear. "Will this happen again?" he seems to ask with just a glance. Alicia sits at her kitchen table, the weight of what happened still heavy in her chest. The report, the formal complaint, it's all laid out in front of her like a final test. She runs her fingers over the paper, her thoughts spinning. Will they listen? Will they believe her? The door opens, and her son walks in, his small hands gripping his backpack like it's the only thing holding him together. He hasn't said much since that day, just quiet, withdrawn. But she can see the fear still lurking in his eyes. "Mom," he says, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you really gonna do it? Are you gonna make them listen?" She looks at him, a brief flicker of doubt crossing her face. She sees the little boy she promised to protect from the world, and she knows that this fight is about more than just her. It's about him too. She takes a deep breath, the decision weighing on her. "I have to," she says, her voice shaking but steady. "If I don't, then nothing changes, and that means you'll always have to live in fear, just like I did. I can't let that happen." Her son nods slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. The next day, Alicia walks into the police station. The walls, once familiar and now foreign, seem colder, more intimidating. She's been here before, but never with a purpose like this. She's ushered into a small office, and across the desk sits the chief of police, his expression a mix of boredom and discomfort. He knows why she's here, and it's clear he'd rather not deal with it. "Mrs. Daniels," he says, glancing at the paper she's handed him. "We'll look into it. But you know how things work, don't you? It's standard procedure." Alicia's hands tighten around the edges of the chair, her breath steady despite the storm inside her. "No," she says, her voice cutting through the air. "It's not. What happened to me was not standard. It was wrong, and I'm not leaving here until you take me seriously." The chief shrugs, his indifference dripping from every word. "You're making a fuss over nothing. This will blow over. These things happen." Alicia stands up, the weight of his dismissal crushing her. She's not naive enough to believe anything will come of this. The system is designed to protect itself, not her, but she won't back down. Not now. Reed sits at his desk, the phone. Call from the department weighing heavily on him. He's been called a traitor. The whispers in the hallway have only grown louder since he stood up for Alicia. He's been a cop for years, but this feels different. He never thought he'd be caught in the middle like this, forced to choose between his duty and his conscience. But he's not backing down either. A knock on his door pulls him from his thoughts. It's one of the younger officers, eyes flickering nervously. "They're talking about you," the officer says quietly, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. "Some of the guys, they think you crossed a line, that you sided with her." Reed rubs his face, feeling the weight of it. He knows what they're saying. He knows the risks. But his mind is made up. "They're wrong," Reed says, his voice steady. "What happened to her wasn't right, and I'm not going to pretend it was." The officer looks at him, unsure of how to respond. Reed's phone buzzes, and he picks it up. The viral video is everywhere now. The community is waking up, and Alicia's voice is being heard. Protests have already started. People are angry. They want change, but the department isn't ready to change. At the town hall meeting, Alicia stands before a sea of faces, no longer just a woman who was wronged, but a voice for those who've been silenced for too long. Her heart pounds in her chest, but her words are steady, measured. "I'm not the first," she says, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I won't be the last. But I'm here today because I refuse to be invisible. My son, our children, they deserve better. We deserve better." The crowd listens, some nodding, others wiping tears from their eyes. She can feel the shift, the change in the air. For the first time in her life, she feels heard, and for the first time in a long time, she feels like she's not alone. Reed watches from the back of the room, the weight of his decision still heavy on his shoulders. He's lost colleagues, friends, even. But the truth is, he can't stay silent any longer. When the moment comes, he steps forward, his voice low but unwavering. "I was there," he says, "and what happened wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of the system, a failure of the people who are supposed to protect and serve. And I will testify against anyone who thinks they can hide behind the badge." There's a murmur in the crowd. Reed doesn't know what will happen after this, but for the first time in his career, he's standing for what's right, not what's easy. Weeks later, Daniels is fired. It's a small victory, but it's a victory. The department can't sweep it under the rug any longer. Alicia sees the news, but she knows this isn't the end. The system, the structures, they haven't changed, but she's done something. She's made a difference. Reed watches the news too, his heart heavy. He hasn't won all the battles, but he's taken the first step toward something different, something better. Alicia and Reed meet again, not as strangers or adversaries, but as allies. Their worlds are still different, but in this moment, they understand each other more than anyone else could. They sit together in the quiet aftermath, their eyes meeting with mutual respect. "It's not enough," Alicia says, her voice tinged with the rawness of everything she's been through. "But it's something," Reed nods, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start." As Alicia drives home, the town quiet beneath her, her son beside her, she looks at the rearview mirror. What she sees isn't the woman she was, the woman who was afraid. What she sees now is a woman who has stood up, not just for herself, but for her son, for everyone who's ever been silenced.